Hello everybody, I'm Rob Burley. I'm Muscular Dystrophy UK's Director of Campaigns, Care and Support. Welcome to the first of two online seminars that MDUK is holding this afternoon as part of our Muscles Matter online seminar series, Living with a Muscle Wasting Condition in 2020 and Beyond. In this series of 12 seminars, we're exploring what it is like to live with a muscle wasting condition in these unprecedented times. 6 of the seminars are exploring specific conditions, and those are aligned to awareness days, weeks and months that are taking place. And the remaining 6 are looking at a range of topics relevant to anyone affected by muscle wasting conditions. So after today, we'll be at the midpoint of the series, and so far we've explored spinal muscular atrophy, Duchenne muscular dystrophy, living in a world with COVID-19 and using assistive and accessible technology. And in this session, of course, we're exploring mitochondrial disease, marking Mitochondrial Disease Awareness Week. Later today, we're also exploring education. And the list of remaining seminars and the link to go to if you want to book on any of those or view the recordings of previous ones should be on your screen now. We're very grateful to Sarepta for supporting the Muscles Matter online seminar series through their generous sponsorship. MDUK is holding these seminars because for now we're unable to bring our community together through our information days, family fun days, national conferences and our muscle groups. I think it's important though just to emphasise that our helpline remains available to anyone affected by muscle wasting conditions, and do please contact us if you have any questions or are in need of any support. We can help you with information and we can either support you directly or point you to where you can get that support. So the number and email address should be on your screen, and the number is 0800 652 6352, and the email address is info@musculardystrophyuk.org. I'd also like to take this opportunity to thank everyone who has supported our work through volunteering their time or by making a donation. We're hugely indebted to everyone who's helped us to ensure that we can continue delivering activity like today's session. There is a vast array of ways in which you can support MDUK, so do please also contact us if you'd like to talk about that or visit our website, either to explore more options or to make a donation. So a note now on how you can ask questions or make comments throughout the session. So we've had several questions in advance, which is great, and we'll seek to cover these later, but we'd also like to incorporate some live input as the discussion unfolds. And to do this, we'll be using the Q&A function, which you should be able to see at the bottom of your screen. Please type your question or comment and we'll feed those questions and comments into the discussion. To help us manage the technical side of the event, we won't be calling on questioners to ask their questions directly. Any questions we don't manage to cover or we don't know the answers to, we'll seek to answer through our website after today's session. And a final reminder that we're recording the session and that we'll make it available later this week on the website. So to start us off this afternoon, I'd like to welcome MDUK's Director of Research and Innovation, Dr. Kate Adcock, who will introduce the research section of this afternoon's seminar. Kate, over to you.
Thank you. Thanks, Rob, and good afternoon, everyone. It's about to say it's lovely to see you, but it's lovely to see our panelists at least. So I'm going to introduce our research speakers first this afternoon. We have 2 fantastic speakers, Dr. Jane from the clinical research, who's a clinical research associate neurologist working in the NHS Rare Mitochondrial Disorders Service, Newcastle upon Tyne Hospital's NHS Foundation Trust. And he's part of the Wellcome Trust Centre for Mitochondrial Research. In addition, this afternoon we'll be hearing from Professor Antonella Spinazzola from the UCL Queen Square Institute of Neurology. So Dr. Ng is an adult neurology specialist trainee, as well as being an NIHR-funded clinical lecturer in neurology. As I say, he's based in Newcastle at the Wellcome Trust Centre for Mitochondrial Research. He's also worked in Edinburgh. He's been working with the clinical service for the NHS Highly Specialised Service for Rare Mitochondrial Disorders since August 2013. And his PhD focused on the clinical characteristics associated with mitochondrial disease when he was working at Newcastle, and his research now focuses on ataxia, that's the loss of movement control in people with mitochondrial disease. Professor Spinazzola started her career in Rome, where she carried out her studies before moving to Columbia University in New York to carry out research where she was part of the team that discovered the first nuclear gene fault that causes mitochondrial DNA dysfunction. Following further research in Milan, she moved to the Medical Research Council Mitochondrial Biology Unit in Cambridge. And then in 2013, she became an MRC Senior Non-Clinical Fellow at MRC's Mill Hill Laboratories in London. And then she joined the Institute of Neurology at the University College London in 2016. Before we move on to asking Dr. Ng and Professor Spinazzola to make their presentations, just to remind everyone that there's the Q&A function in the Zoom call, so do feel free to ask some questions there as we go along. So, right, if I could first ask you, Yi, to start your presentation, and Kat will use the functionality to share your slides. And
okay.
If you just ask her to move on next slide, and she'll move things forward.
Yeah. Okay. Hello, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dr. Ng. I'm a neurology doctor, and thank you for the introductions by Kate, and very grateful that MDUK invite me to talk about mitochondrial diseases and current state of drug studies. It's Mito Awareness Week, and I hope that you will take every opportunity to talk about mito with your friends and families. Next slide, please. Mitochondria are organelles found in all nucleated cells in our body. The term mitochondrion originally derived from the Greek. Mito refers to thread, and chondrion means granules. In a textbook, as you can see here, mitochondria are always drawn like elongated peanuts. They have multiple functions in cells. Perhaps the most well-known one, and the most important one, is to generate energy from the food we eat. The machineries of converting food to energies located in the inner membrane of mitochondria. There are 5 complexes. They are referred as complex 1 to 5. Complex 1 to 4, the components of machineries are often referred as mitochondrial respiratory change, and complex 5 is called ATP synthase. This process of energy production requires oxygen, and therefore is also known as oxidative phosphorylation. Next, please. Scientists have learned that mitochondria, in fact, are very dynamic organelles. As you can see from this microscopic picture, mitochondria are able to form very complex network depending on the metabolic demands of the cells. Next, please. And yep, and if you can click and another time, yeah. So you would have heard that 99.9% of our genetic materials are stored in chromosomes that are located in the nucleus. The remaining 0.1% of genetic materials are found in mitochondria, and they are called mitochondrial DNA. Each mitochondrial DNA only contains 37 genes. What is unique about mitochondrial DNA is you can find hundreds and thousands copies of them in each cell. We know that the vast majority of the building blocks for mitochondria and the machineries that I discussed earlier are derived from the nucleus, and only 13 proteins are coded by mitochondrial DNA. Therefore, if there's a genetic mutations or a defect, either in the mitochondrial DNA, that 0.1%, or in the nucleus, could lead to mitochondrial dysfunctions and causing disease. Next, please. High energy demands organs such as brain, muscles, nerve, heart, and liver are very susceptible to mitochondrial dysfunctions. Multi-system involvement is observed in many forms of mitochondrial diseases, with some exceptions, such as Leber hereditary optic neuropathy is a form of mitochondrial DNA disease that affects the nerves at the back of the eyes, causing blindness. Depending on the onset of the disease and the constellations of presenting clinical features, medically, we could group them into different syndromes, as you can see here in adults and pediatrics, you may have come across CPO, Millar's, or Lee syndromes. Increasingly from the clinic, we recognize that only a very small proportions of individuals will develop all the features that first describe or associated with individual syndrome. Next, please. I mentioned that the inheritance of mitochondrial disease depends on where the genetic mutation occurs. If there's a spelling mistake or genetic defect in the nucleus, the inheritance patterns could include the following. On the left, autosomal dominant with risk of 1 in 2 and chance of transmissions, autosomal recessive, which is 1 in 4 chance, or less commonly X-linked. Next slide, please. There are several unique characteristics associated with mitochondrial DNA, that 0.1% of extranuclear materials. First of all mitochondrial DNAs are maternally inherited. As you recall that there are hundreds to thousands copies of mitochondrial DNA per cell. When there is a spelling mistake, sometimes all of these hundreds and thousands mitochondrial DNA have that mutation, and therefore it is a circumstances we refer as homoplasmy. However, if there's only a proportions of mitochondrial DNA have the mutations mixed with a normal mitochondrial DNA, that is a scenario we say heteroplasmy. Generally speaking, the higher the heteroplasmy levels, the more likely one will develop symptoms and disease. However, the precise threshold for the expression of disease varies depending on what the genetic mutations are. Next, please. So what frequently complicates matters is that this heteroplasmy level, i.e. the mixture of normal and abnormal mitochondrial DNAs, frequently are different between cells, between organs, and even between family members and different generations, as you can see here. Next slide, please. Why does it matter? And if you can click the, a few more times, yeah. So why does it matter to know these heteroplasmy levels? It's because determining the heteroplasmy level between tissues and family members could help clinicians understand how individuals is affected and what complications they may develop in the future. So we always say that no patients are the same in the mitochondrial clinic because that seems to be the norm. Next, please. Next. So how common is mitochondrial disease as a whole? Well, the prevalence study suggests that is about 1 in 4,300. And what is the concept of that? So this about equivalent to 15,000 people living with any forms of mitochondrial disease at any point in the UK. And next, please. So this prevalence level is very comparable, if not much more common than other forms of neurogenetic conditions, as you can see here. Next, please. In the adult populations, 75% of the mitochondrial disease are due to mutations in the mitochondrial DNA. Many of them are maternally inherited. The remaining cases of that, a quarter of the cases are due to a spelling mistake or gene defects in the nucleus. It is important to stress that the distributions of such genetic landscape is complete opposite in the pediatric populations. What I mean is that 3/4 of the cases in pediatric population is due to a spelling mistake in the nucleus, and autosomal recessive inheritance is most common. Next, please. This bar chart summarizes the range of symptoms and organ involvement in adult patients. Muscular symptoms are common. The muscles controlling the upper eyelids and eye movements are most frequently affected in adult patients. Proximal muscles, such as the shoulder and hip girdles, are also commonly affected, so nearly half of the patients have some forms of muscle weakness, leading to exercise intolerance and impaired mobility. As you can see from the pictures here, gastrointestinal symptoms are fairly prevalent. it is not very surprising if you think about the movements of the GI tract is actually controlled by smooth muscles, which are also very susceptible to mitochondrial dysfunctions. Other symptoms that you may have come across frequently in adult mitochondrial disease, including hearing loss and cerebellar ataxia. Next, please. Yeah, next. Yeah. Okay, so treatment strategies. The main management of, I think have we missed one slide on the previous slide? Okay, so don't worry. So the main management of mitochondrial disease is supportive in nature. There are major progress has been made to underpin genetic diagnosis over the last 10 years. Currently, the field in the mitochondrial disease is shifting towards identifying more effective treatments. There are two main strategies of how scientists can develop treatment strategies: a very generic non-targeted approach versus a very specific genetic or disease-specific treatment. One example for non-targeted approach is to improve a general muscle functions that are applicable to all sort of mitochondrial disease, versus a gene therapy for Leber's hereditary optic neuropathy that aims to treat the optic nerve dysfunctions. This cartoon here summarizes the mechanistic basis of various novel treatments for mitochondrial disease. As you can see on the top left corner, the most common approach for treating mitochondrial myopathy is to boost the number of healthy mitochondria, or what we call promoting mitochondrial biogenesis. On the other hand, in the bottoms of these cartoons, antioxidant therapy is another generic approach that aims to tackle increased productions of reactive oxygen species due to mitochondrial dysfunctions. The one that with the orange or brown colors and refers to mitochondrial replacement therapy or mitochondrial donations in the UK, which has become an approved clinical method to prevent transmissions of mitochondrial DNA mutations. So they are very specific to mitochondrial DNA mutations. Next. Yeah. Okay. So next. So this world map from clinicaltrials.gov summarizes the number of interventional studies, which most of them are currently take place in North America and Europe. Next. Yep. So in Europe, as you can see, UK is one of the leading countries of conducting drug trials for mitochondrial diseases. And next. Two major centers that are currently recruiting for drug trials are Newcastle and London UCL. Next, please. So this bar chart shows us clinical trials either completed or currently recruiting in different subtypes of mitochondrial disease. As you can see that mitochondrial myopathy has most studies, followed by Leber's hereditary optic neuropathies. That, as you can imagine, is that because myopathies is quite common symptoms across different genotypes, and that's why there is such a big efforts putting into that. Brain involvement or neurodegenerations in mitochondrial diseases such as Miller syndrome and Lee syndrome remains very difficult to treat, as reflected by small numbers of drug trials that are currently available. Next. There are unique challenges in mitochondrial research, which include multiple genetic causes, of which many of them are very rare. The natural histories of individual genetic disease are not very well characterized, and we're still learning a lot about what is the best way to measure these conditions as they progress. Next. There are currently 3 national centers for mitochondrial disease for both diagnosis and clinical care in the UK. As you can see, this center is located in Newcastle, Oxford, and Victoria is one of the lead for the Oxford Center and London UCL. And in these centers, we offer genetic counseling, advice on clinical management, as well as recruiting patients into various research studies. We encourage all patients with mitochondrial disease to take part in the natural history study or the patient registry for two obvious reasons. One, it allows us to better understand about how that disease changes with time, but also allow us to have a more rapid screening and recruitment to relevant drug studies. Next, please. So that is a very quick tour about mitochondrial disease, the genetics, and what's going on in terms of the drug studies. So these are just, I'm essentially representing the teams of doing this talk, and I welcome questions.
Thank you very much. Yeah, that's fantastic, really interesting. If I can ask us to go straight into Antonella's talk now, and then we'll take all the questions as one sort of session, if that's okay. So if my colleague can tee up Antonella's slides, then Antonella, over to you. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to share with you, first for the invitation, share with you what we are doing in our lab. Next. We have just heard that the main function of mitochondria is to generate energy. And therefore, tissues with a high energy requirement, like muscle and brain, are often affected by mitochondrial dysfunction. Next. A critical element for mitochondrial ATP production is the DNA inside the organelles, because it encodes several essential components of the energy producing machinery. Therefore, any defect in mitochondrial DNA can cause an energy crisis and disease. Next. Most mitochondrial DNA disorders are due to problems in the quantity or quality of mitochondrial DNA. However, because there are thousands of copies of mitochondrial DNA within each cell, disease only manifests when over half of these copies are mutated, damaged, or lost. Since the start of my career, I have worked at the discovery and the characterization of this type of the disorders. In the next few slides, I will share with you what we are doing in our lab to develop rational therapies for them. Next. The first approach, before the previous one, please. The first approach concerns decreasing the numbers of mutant mitochondrial DNAs. Next. Most of the deleterious mitochondrial DNA variants, including the most common cause of the MELA syndrome, the 3243A2G mutation, affect some, but not all the copies of the mitochondrial DNA. As we have heard, a state known as heteroplasmy. Importantly, this mutant causes the dysfunction of mitochondria and therefore disease only at very high level. This means that to restore mitochondrial function is not necessary to eradicate all the mutant mitochondrial DNA. Next. Instead, it should be sufficient to decrease the mutant load before the threshold to go from the disease to healthy state. And therefore, it has been a long-standing goal in the field of mitochondrial DNA disorders to find a means of decreasing the mutant load, as this could provide an effective therapy. And this is what we have recently achieved in our lab. Next. We have identified small molecules that promote the selection of functioning mitochondrial DNA in cells derived from patients carrying the 3243 mutation. Importantly, next, the beneficial effect of the drugs occur without cell death, meaning that there is not the death of the cells with high level of the mutant mitochondrial DNA. Next. The decrease in mutant load restores the mitochondrial function, including mitochondrial protein synthesis. As you see in the vehicle, there are no protein completely restored with the drug A, the level of the subunit of the respiratory chain, and mitochondrial respiration. Next. What is the molecular mechanism of the selection? In theory, the small molecules could work in two ways. The decrease in mutant load could be due to a selective degradation of the bad mitochondrial DNAs or a preferential replication of the functional molecules. Next. There was no indication of the selective degradation. Actually, quite the opposite in our case, as the small molecules inhibit autophagy in the mutant cells. Next. Moreover, there was no changes in the DNA levels based on the DNA staining, the green dots, and the quantitative analysis on the right. However, next, when we measure the de novo synthesis of the mitochondrial replication followed the BRDU incorporation, in this case is the green dot versus the total DNA, which is the red dot, while the small molecules did not have any effect in control cells, next, the labeling was markedly decreased in the mutant cells. However, next, there were some foci, this is very corrupted, there were some mitochondrial DNA foci in the mutant cells. And this led us to hypothesize that the small molecules support the replication of the functional molecules. If so, then the mitochondrial DNA replication should be restored when the mutant load drops. And this was exactly what we saw. Next. When the mutant load went from 85% after 1 week of drug A to 60% after 4 weeks of drug A, the replication of mitochondrial DNA was completely restored. Therefore, to summarize, next, this part, we have identified 2 small molecules that decrease the mutant load in culture cells. The decrease in mutant mitochondrial DNA restores completely the mitochondrial function, and we have shown that the drug works by inhibiting the replication of the mutant molecules. The next step is the biggest of all, which is to test the drug in patients affected by the disease. Fortunately, one of the drugs has been used in humans safely, and therefore it could be repurposed for the treatment of mitochondrial disorders. Next, we are launching an experimental messaging studies supported by the MDUK and the Lilly Foundation to test the safety and the efficacy of the drug in patients affected by mitochondrial myopathy with the 3243 mutation. Next, the second approach aims to restore the quantity of mitochondrial DNA. Next. We and others have shown that insufficient or unbalanced deoxynucleoside, which are the building block of the DNA, can affect the synthesis and the fidelity of the mitochondrial DNA, resulting in scarce or damaged molecules, and therefore disease. Next. These nucleotides are also small molecules, and the supplementation of the medium in culture cells with extra nucleotide completely restore the mitochondrial DNA quantity and the mitochondrial function in cells derived from patients affected by this type of the disorders. Next. One study has found that this strategy is also beneficial in vivo in a mouse model of the mitochondrial disorder due to thymidine kinase 2 deficiency, which affect the pyrimidine nucleotide. Next. In our lab, we are working on a mouse model where the purine metabolism is mainly affected. And we are testing if the supplementation in vivo is able to rescue the mitochondrial DNA copy number and therefore the function in liver and muscle. Next. Therefore, after many years, we are start beginning to see the fruit of our studies, and the novel approach offer a hope for the treatment of mitochondrial DNA disorder that could potentially be transferred to the clinic in the near future. Next. I would like to thank all the people involved in the work. Ian Holt is the other PI that together with me is leading these two projects, and the young scientists that actually they've done the work in the lab. For the small molecule and the mitochondrial DNA disorder, the 3243 mutation, Daniel Ives, Maramin Nuni, and Boris Pantic. For the deoxynucleoside supplementation, Ilaria Della Rosa and Diego Rodriguez. In all the collaboration in Newcastle and UCL, and of course, the funding bodies. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you very much yourself, Antonella. So we have had some questions come through the Q&A function. We've also had 1 or 2 questions in advance. So without further ado, let's kick off. So one of the questions that was submitted in advance was asked about how does mitochondrial disease distinguish itself from Charcot-Marie-Tooth? I think, Yi, if I can start with you, and then Antonella, if there's anything you would like to discuss, and then we'll also maybe raise it with the broader panel a bit later on this afternoon.
Okay, sure. So, and for anyone who doesn't know, Charcot-Marie-Tooth refers to groups of genetic neuropathy. So people predominantly presented with abnormal shapes of their feet, and then weakness and possibly numbness that can affect both hands and feet. And so on the clinical ground, sometimes it may not be very clear-cut to distinguish whether the neuropathy is definitely CMT or whether it could be mitochondrial disease that presented with neuropathy. So the only way that to tell for sure is through genetic testing. And increasingly, we also know that some of the proteins or genes that cause CMT actually have mitochondrial functions. So to be fair, I think science actually converge more these days rather than diverge, because I think being a person who works in mitochondrial disease, I could always say that anything can link back to mitochondria. I'm sure Antonella can and Victoria can echo that.
Thank you. Antonella, do you want to add anything to that? Yeah, no, I think that genetic definitely is important. In a number of cases with the mitochondrial DNA disorder due to nuclear gene, actually, we can see a presentation like Charcot-Marie. So therefore, the genetic is fundamental.
Super, thank you both. Now we've had a question from the audience today. Someone with mitochondrial myopathy is asking if any holistic therapies such as kinesiology or Reiki have been proven to be useful for mitochondrial diseases. Maybe Yi, that's more for you, slightly on the clinical side.
So thank you for the questions. So as far as I know, there is no registered clinical studies to look into this particular specific interventions. Perhaps if for me as clinicians, or maybe for Jane as a physiotherapist, if the therapy is any forms of exercise, we can say that there are good evidence to support it's good for the mitochondrial health, but it's also good for the general cardiovascular fitness.
Super, right. Maybe we can touch on that again in a little while. You also mentioned about Lee syndrome, and you also mentioned that there are maybe 1 or 2 clinical trials happening now in Lee syndrome. Are you aware of any recent research developments in Lee syndrome?
Sure. So this is probably the area that Victoria has more knowledge than me, so because I work as an adult neurologist. But Lee syndromes remains one of the most challenging syndromes in mitochondrial disease. And one is because more than 80 genes can cause it. And all of them could behave quite differently, how they change, how this patient progress, and also to develop a compound that will actually target the central nervous system. I think that is another holy grail for the field at the moment, is how to deliver a drugs early enough to the CNS. So I think there are pharmaceutical companies is looking into that, but I think getting enough patient number would be another big challenge.
Can I just look to you, sorry Victoria, but Yi has sort of somewhat highlighted that perhaps you might have something, and I saw you nodding, so maybe if you could just come in here.
Yeah, so absolutely. Yi has hit the nail on the head really there. So Lee syndrome is such a broad spectrum that we see in mitochondrial disease. It's the most commonly recognized syndrome that we have in childhood mitochondrial disease. But within that, we have a vast array of different genotypes that cause the disease. We have lots of children who present in the same way but have different biochemical deficiencies on their muscle biopsies. We have some children who have completely normal muscle biopsies. So getting a clinical trial together that is robust enough is quite tricky. So you would have to group them ideally by genotype, but like Yi's already alluded to, numbers wise, that would still be quite tricky to have anything definitive.
Thank you, that's very clear, thank you. Actually, picking up on the theme of clinical trials, could someone with suspected mitochondrial disease but who hasn't got a genetic diagnosis be included in a clinical trial? Yeah, I guess that one's for you as well.
It's probably for me or for Jane or for Victoria, I guess. So unfortunately, when it comes to clinical studies, there is a very clear inclusion criterion. Often the first one is one has to have a genetic defined conditions. So without a genetic diagnosis, I'm, as far as I know, most of the clinical studies wouldn't accept anyone who currently have not had a genetic diagnosis. But if there is any concerns or issues in regards of finding the correct diagnosis, and there's always local and genetic network, and if they wish, they can always refer on to one of the centers and to discuss further if there's anything that we can help with.
Fantastic, thank you. And there's a question here, there's a question we've received which I think actually will work well for the panel discussion. But there's also another question about what is the latest research on KSS? Now, forgive me, I may not pronounce this correctly. Is that Kearns-Sayre syndrome? Perhaps you can correct my pronunciation. Yi, again, if you wouldn't mind. Do you know anything on that?
So I think Kearns-Sayre syndromes is perhaps a syndrome that actually will cross between childhood and young adulthood. So what we know is due to, remember the mitochondrial DNA is a circle. If you imagine a chunk of it is missing, and that is often the genetic diagnosis that caused that. It tends to affect a lot of organs other than muscles, nerve, and at the back of the eyes, the heart. And so I think, Antonella, you might know about this. I think that's currently some companies is trying to look at whether replacing healthy mitochondrial DNA by blood transfusions may help with the Pearson syndrome, which is a pre-prodrome of Pearson syndrome. But I think at the moment we're still waiting to see more evidence of that. But the myopathy components of KSS would actually be eligible for many of the drug trials because they do have a lot of muscle weakness.
Super, thank you. Now I'm conscious of time and we are kind of moving on, and I'm conscious that we have the rest of the panel. So Yi and Antonella, may I thank you both very much for your really interesting and informative presentations. Yi, I believe you're staying with us now for the presentation. Antonella, you're very welcome to stay on the line if you would like to, or if you would like to leave us, whichever works for you. So thank you again. That's the end of the research session. Do keep asking questions on the question and answer function. As I say, there's one there that we'll pick up on in a moment, but we've somewhat rudely had Antonella, Victoria answering questions, and I haven't even had the chance to introduce her yet. So now I'd like to introduce the rest of the panel, if I may. So Victoria Nesbitt, who we've heard from already, is consultant paediatrician at Oxford Children's Hospital and the Rare Mitochondrial Disorder Service in Oxford, as you mentioned earlier. She specialises in neurodisability and has worked with families affected by mitochondrial diseases for over 12 years. She completed her PhD in mitochondrial diseases in children at Newcastle University, whilst working as a clinical research associate at the Wellcome Trust Centre for Mitochondrial Diseases. She's now the clinical lead for the NHS Highly Specialised Service for Rare Mitochondrial Diseases in Oxford, where she's also an honorary senior clinical lecturer in paediatrics. She's a principal investigator at the MDUK Oxford Neuromuscular Centre and for the Mitochondrial Diseases Cohort Study UK. Dr Jane Newman is a research physiotherapist. She's also based at the Wellcome Centre for Mitochondrial Research in Newcastle. She qualified as a physiotherapist in 1987 and has worked within the field of neurology for nearly 20 years. She first became involved with patients with mitochondrial disease whilst working in the regional neurology ward at the Royal Victoria Infirmary, and she was also involved in an exercise trial with colleagues in Dallas in the US. This trial triggered her interest in a group of patients with mitochondrial diseases and the possibility of being involved in research. And she's currently working on a number of trials looking at the effect of exercise in neuromuscular disease, as well as devising clinical guidelines for physiotherapy management in mitochondrial disease. And last but by no means least, we have Jodi Allen completing the triangle of the specialist sites in the UK. Jodi is a senior speech and language therapist at the National Hospital for Neurology and Neurosurgery in Queen Square, London. And she specialises in the diagnosis and management of swallowing and motor speech disorders in patients living with neurological or neuromuscular conditions. She's part funded by the National Institute of Health Research, where she's currently undertaking research related to swallowing difficulties in neuromuscular diseases. So each of our panelists are going to kind of start by having a few thoughts for themselves about mitochondrial diseases, and then we'll come back to your questions. So do feel free to answer or ask questions in the Q&A function. So Yi, sorry, coming back to you again. Yeah. I wonder if you could build a little bit on what you covered in the research session and explain a bit about what helps us to understand about them from the research about management and treatment of mitochondrial diseases.
Sure. I think what I guess is looking back, what struck me the most when I first met with my first mitochondrial disease patient is how variable they are. And then when you go to the clinic, when you see the same genetic defects, how they are different, and even between the family members, I think that is the thing that probably struck me the most. In certain way, the awareness of mitochondrial disease has been raised significantly in the last 5 to 10 years, and actually being part of the research communities to try to bring research back to patients, I think is very exciting. And we are probably still at the beginning stage compared to other more established and genetic conditions, but I think the time is coming for mitochondrial patients.
Fantastic, thank you. And Victoria, I wonder if you could give us an overview of the kind of support your services provide for people living with mitochondrial disease.
Yes, of course. So as you said, there are 3 mitochondrial centres in the UK based in Newcastle, Oxford and London. We are funded by the NHS Highly Specialised Services, all do pretty much the same thing in each of the centres. So it's a real unified approach that we have moving forward. Geographically, we're positioned such that we try and cover the whole of the country, but you can actually be referred to any centre. So we have some patients that opt to travel much further than they need to, purely because they've got other family members that go there. So that works well for them, and we're very open to that. We're generally quite a flexible service. We don't accept referrals directly from GPs unless there is a primary genetic diagnosis known in the family. And that's partly because of a service limitation, essentially. So there are only so many of us, and there are already thousands of mitochondrial patients in the UK. So if you have suspicion that you have a mitochondrial disease, you need to see your GP yourself, who will then refer you on appropriately, usually to a local neurologist, who will then decide on which investigations are suitable for you and then refer on to us if there is biochemical or genetic suspicion of mitochondrial disease. I think one of the things that we try and do as the 3 centres is to provide information and support to patients, be that children or adults and their families, and to try and empower the primary and secondary care teams that are more involved in looking after these patients on a daily basis than we are. We also link into education and social care, again, to try and empower those local teams to deal with what is an incredibly complex disorder. We aim for preventative medicine. So as we know, there is no cure for mitochondrial disease at present. So we like to promote social development. Like I say, we're very, very pro preventative medicine. So many of our patients will have been given mitochondrial diseases alert cards, personalised emergency management sheets. In Oxford, we have a non-urgent email address. All 3 centres have got clinical nurse specialists where patients can contact them directly by phone. And I think all 3 centres now use social media of some kind as well to promote the service. We are incredibly fortunate to be supported by Muscular Dystrophy UK in all 3 centres, not just from a research perspective, but actually from a clinical patient-focused care perspective as well as by the Lilly Foundation. They're doing a lot of work this week for Global Mitochondrial Awareness Week, so I'm sure everybody will have seen some slogans on social media, if nowhere else, and look out for the buildings being lit up green this week in support of patients with mitochondrial disease as well.
Fantastic, thank you very much. And Jane, turning to you, physiotherapy is clearly a vital aspect of care for people living with mitochondrial disease. Could you tell us why this is and explain some of the key principles that physiotherapists follow when working with patients with mitochondrial disease?
Yeah, well, I'm probably going to repeat a lot of what Yi and Victoria have already said, in the fact that, as we've already said, our patients are really, really variable in their presentation with their mitochondrial disorder. So I think the main thing that I always say to patients that I see is that your physiotherapy needs to be individual to you, because everybody is different. And we know that quite a lot of our patients are quite sedentary. They don't move around much for a variety of reasons, but we also know that that has a secondary effect on their mitochondria. And so it's really important that we keep our patients as active as they can be. This sometimes is difficult and they need a lot of support to do that. But there are probably only a few patients with mitochondrial disease who we'd say you have to be a bit more careful about. And so Sarah Holmes, the physio at Queen Square, and myself did write some guidelines, and they are on the website for the Wellcome Centre and the Rare Diseases website about what kind of things you should and shouldn't do, and kind of things you need to be aware of when you're going to start exercising. And I think the main thing is that the patient, when they get referred to their local physio, what we try and do is, because as Victoria says, we cover the whole country, so there's no way we can see everybody. So I try and make it available so that a local physio who may have never seen someone with mitochondrial disease before has a name to contact. So Sarah and I get a lot of phone calls from local physios just to ask for advice, and hopefully we can support that physio in saying, no, you're fine, go ahead, do whatever you like, or no, you have to be a bit careful with this person. But the main thing is there's a multitude of symptoms and there's a multitude of benefits to having physiotherapy, and it really depends on you as an individual and how your disease is presenting. So it's very difficult to give a one-size-fits-all.
Sure. Sorry for asking a one-size-fits-all question.
That's all right.
Which I'm sort of going to do to Jodi, I suppose, as well, because I mean, obviously the role of the speech and language therapist is a very specific one, and I wonder whether you could outline perhaps some of the things that you do to support mitochondrial patients.
Yeah, of course. I have to say it's quite nice to be sitting on a panel with so many experts, and it's nice as a speech therapist to be invited onto panels like this to raise awareness actually of the role of the speech therapist, also the condition specific aspects that some of our patients don't always recognise as part of their condition. Similar to Jane, actually, we work quite proactively in our neuromuscular centre. And we look out for problems early on. And the main things we look out for as speech therapists are issues related to chewing and swallowing, which can have longer term consequences like losing weight or things going down the wrong hole. And as the title's a little bit misleading, because we don't do lots and lots of speech therapy, but we do work with some of our mitochondrial patients and patients with neuromuscular disease to try and optimize communication when they do have speech changes, because of course communication and speech changes are so important in participating out in the community and having a social role as well. So we span the spectrum of everything, kind of shoulders up.
Fantastic. Oh, that's great. Thank you very much. So thank you very much everyone for sort of giving a very good overview of the services that you provide. One of the things that actually hasn't come up yet in discussion, which, given that we've been speaking for nearly an hour now, it's actually quite surprised me, it's quite refreshing in some respects, is that clearly we're not meeting face to face, we're all on a Zoom call because of the impact of COVID. And I wonder whether, maybe Victoria, if I could start with you, could you explain how your services have adapted to deal with the COVID situation?
Yeah, absolutely. So yes, I agree. It was quite nice not to speak about COVID for an hour. Yeah, but it's a really, I mean, this is at the forefront of everybody's daily life at the moment. So yes, and again, this was where our joined up working with the 3 centres and our partnerships with charities really came into play. So we released statements and letters very early on at the lockdown period so that all patients were getting the same information. There's nothing worse than one patient being told one thing and then 2 miles down the road you're being told something else. So again, yes, there were statements on our websites and going out to individual patients or clinicians as well. We provided resources for parents to keep their children entertained during lockdown. So those of us who've got children will know that's not necessarily a simple thing. Homeschooling is not as easy as people made out. So yes, we did provide some alternatives for them. Again, links with MDUK and the Lilly Foundation to promote more of the social well-being side of things. Social development's incredibly important, not just for children, but for adults living with a chronic medical condition. That's a huge change to your emotional well-being, and we were quite keen to promote that early on. I think the 3 centres tried to really run the clinical service as normal as we possibly could without seeing patients face to face. So we were offering telephone appointments, video conferencing calls, email chats and the like. So hopefully patients that are seen in the 3 centres don't feel that they've been neglected in any way. Certainly in Oxford, face-to-face clinics have now restarted. They're a bit different to how they used to be, a bit more restricted and the likes. But we're still offering telephone appointments or video consultations for those who don't feel ready to travel as yet. Yeah.
Super, thank you. And is that the same sort of thing that's happening in Newcastle as well, that the services are starting, face-to-face services are starting up again? And
yeah, I think as Victoria said, there's lots of activities actually run behind the scene in terms of preparing our communities with the COVID-19. Going to the lockdown is probably more straightforward compared to coming out of it, and because everyone have different levels of mental preparedness for that. So yes, I think the very good things for this COVID-19 challenge I find is actually adopting the technologies. You know, we used to assume that people in an older generation may struggle with video calls, but actually I've done quite a few of them. Actually, I'm very surprised. They just say it's very straightforward. So the technology, I think, and get integrated more rapidly and then what the normal times would be. So I think that is the good thing. And I agree. And face-to-face coming back, and I mean, face-to-face allowed that human contact, but also sometimes the only problems you can pick up is by examinations that you will not pick up by the phone.
Super, thank you. Jane, perhaps is it more difficult to help someone with physiotherapy if you're not in the same room as them?
Yes, it is, and it isn't, I suppose. Some of our patients have been in contact a lot, and we've managed to communicate what they need to do and things like that. And I've also done, as Yi said, we've done a couple of video conferencing where we've had them hold their cameras up and they've walked around so we can assess what they're doing. And also we've started in Newcastle to use an exercise platform that means that I can provide patients with videos of different exercises, whereas usually what I would do is if I see them in the clinic, sometimes we video the exercises while they're there, so they've got a record to take home with them. But we've managed to use a platform that hopefully going forward might be helpful in that. And also I know that Sarah in London has also they've done some videos on their Pilates, which they're giving to patients who they've seen who know how to do the exercises, because that's a bit more difficult to teach on a one-off basis. So we're using all different tricks of the trade to try and get our message across, but hopefully our patients know that we are always at the end of a phone and they always are quite willing to contact us.
Super, thank you. And Jodi, I guess for you as well, there are probably pros and cons for the remote access appointment.
Yeah, I was just thinking as Jane was talking, actually, one of the challenges I think of the remote access is particularly for people with mitochondrial diseases, because of that variability. If you haven't met a patient face to face, it's often difficult to predict or anticipate what kind of advice they might need from a speech and swallowing point of view. But certainly one of the benefits is because there's a hospital, we switched, Sarah Holmes I know has been using video consultations just like this, and we switched to that quite quickly, and it meant that we could keep up and support our local speech and language therapists, because it's actually quite difficult to find a speech therapist who specialises into something very niche like mitochondrial disease. So it meant as a more specialist speech therapist, I could do a little bit more outreaching to people with mitochondrial disease and other diseases that are more rare into their own home, whereas often that may be left with our community teams who are absolutely brilliant, but usually we would end up talking with the speech therapist and creating a bit of a tripod of contacts rather than direct. So it's actually worked out quite nicely and formed quite a lot of links with our local services, which is the way we like to operate.
Fantastic. And I guess it's a question to all of you about, oh, sorry, go on. Sorry, Antonella.
I would like to make a comment, or to ask a question to the people that work more with the patients now. So we know that mitochondria use food. I mean, he said at the beginning, transform the food in energy. So what we see in the cells in the lab and also in the mouse model that they use a different type of food differently according to the defect. So is there any program related to nutritional education and diet support? Because I know mainly when I was doing clinical work, that according to what they eat, they feel worse or better. So I don't know if there is something that, in Newcastle, it's even in the clinic, in the different clinical settings done on the nutritional side, because we see in the cells and in the mouse that this completely change how they are.
Yeah. Ooh, this is a
controversial
question, Professor. I think you're right. I think we probably sometimes we see that, like patients with glycogen storage disorders or patients with fatty acid oxidation defect, certain type of food seems to make their symptoms worse. And we've been looking into in terms of how do we improve the gut health, and we did a studies on the low residuals diet, essentially cut down the fibers, see whether that would actually alleviate the gastrointestinal.
It's 14 hours.
But we haven't done any kind of prospective studies just in terms of whether for example is it high fat diet best for our patients? Is this high carbohydrate, what the ratio should be? And we haven't done that, but I agree it's a field that we get asked all the time. What should I eat?
Maybe this is a provocation. We need a kind of figure, institutionalized figure that really manage the nutrition of these patients, because mitochondria, this is what they do.
Yeah.
And they can choose one type of person. Yeah, sorry, Victoria.
Good. I think moving away from kind of food groups per se.
Oh. Is that just me, or is that Victoria?
I think Victoria, we lost.
Just frozen.
Right, we'll come back to Victoria when she when she unfreezes.
Actually, I think what you would find anecdotally to feel unwell. So you know.
Sorry. Could you go back to the bit you froze for a moment there?
Oh, sorry.
So go back to the beginning. Sorry.
Sorry. Yes. No. I was just saying that moving away slightly from food groups to the way we eat our food. Certainly in the children with mitochondrial disease, I advise little and often. So we find that those who carbohydrate load and then have a really long gap before they eat again tend to fatigue more quickly. They get a lot more nausea, their symptoms tend to get worse. Whereas actually if you're eating little and often, so kind of 6 smaller meals a day as opposed to 3 large, you definitely have a better control of your glucose, which presumably is keeping your lactate levels down, and you're not stressing the mitochondria in the same way. So it's not necessarily related to the food groups as much as the timing of eating as well.
And we do the same with any exercise. We always make sure that that's the key thing, that patients should never exercise without any food on board. It's really critical that they don't have long periods of fasting. Is just not recommended.
Fantastic, thank you. Just turning to some questions from our Q&A function on Zoom. Somebody's asked, saying that they're unsure which specific type of mitochondrial myopathy that they have. They've never been told. So they're unsure what information is appropriate for them. Maybe Yi and Victoria, maybe you could give some advice there. Start with you, Yi.
Okay. So I think it's right. I mean, in the past decades, a lot of the mitochondrial disease was diagnosed based on what the muscle biopsy appearance looks like. But unfortunately, that doesn't take us any forward in terms of understanding what caused it. So I think to start with, it's always good to actually clarify with the clinicians who originally make the diagnosis, because first of all, you need to work out, is it in the mitochondrial DNA? Or is that actually in the nucleus? So from a genetic counseling perspective, that is probably the first slide to consider. And then the next slide, when it comes to the times of consider for clinical trials, we need to know the names of the disease before one can participate. So there's clearly many reasons why it's important to clarify the genetic diagnosis, if possible.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Yi. And ultimately, a patient should be able to ask what they've got. You know, they shouldn't be worried about asking. And if you have to ask at every clinic appointment, it doesn't matter. It's you know, we don't expect you to retain all of the information that we give you each time. So yeah, just go back to whoever your doctor is and ask them if they can clarify. There are lots of generic advice that we give, like exercise, like Jane said, although patients have specific exercise programs. As a general rule, we like patients to stay active as best they can. Preventing dehydration and fasting, they're really important, because we know that if you do those, you stress your mitochondria. So there are lots of general health measures, and again, that can be found on the national website under advice for patients. So that's definitely worth looking at.
Fantastic, thank you. And I hope that was helpful for the person who asked the question. Going back to COVID now, there's a question here about whether someone with Leigh syndrome is more likely to, or how likely someone with Leigh syndrome, or perhaps any other mitochondrial condition, be to contract COVID. So I guess, does it increase the chance of getting infected?
So when COVID first appeared, we as a group were very, very concerned that there our patient group could be at an increased risk, not necessarily of contracting COVID if they've got normal immune function, but the effects that COVID could have on them. So when I talked earlier about we like preventative medicine, that's really to try and prevent deterioration in symptoms. So something that we generally call a metabolic decompensation. A bit of a mouthful, really. Just means a deterioration. That's all. And that was our worry, really. So the statements we released initially were about shielding, then that all mitochondrial patients should shield because of the risk of this metabolic decompensation.
Ooh. We've lost Victoria again, I think, haven't we? Or is it me? Oh no, okay, I'm seeing shaking and nodding, so I'm seeing other people moving.
Now, it's difficult to know whether or not. What I can say of those who, oh sorry,
Right.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Am I back? Yeah. So there's two things really to think about with regards to COVID. One is everybody did shield. So we can't categorically say that mitochondrial patients aren't at increased risk because they haven't been exposed to it in society in the same way. However, what we can say, and this is from work that UCL did in London, they have a database where clinicians across Europe have been inputting data for patients with neuromuscular disorders, looking at symptoms of COVID, and it does not appear on the data we have so far that mitochondrial disease patients are any more susceptible. So they don't seem to have had more severe effects of COVID, which is very, very reassuring. It's still a watch this space because, like I say, shielding's only just ended, really. We're only into the first few weeks of mitochondrial patients integrating back into society, but the evidence we've got at the moment is reassuring.
And that point around the data that has been collected from across Europe, that applies to lots of different neuromuscular conditions.
Absolutely.
So it's not just about mitochondrial disease, is it? So it's about many different conditions.
That's right.
The community has been absolutely fantastic actually at shielding, because it's one of those cases where actually we're glad we don't have the data, because I guess in some respects, because it means that people have been doing a really good job at keeping themselves
yes, I would agree, Kate. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, great, super, thank you. Now we've got some fantastic questions here, and excuse me while I just lean over and have a look. Oh, they've just popped along, moved. What are the main considerations included in your decision-making processes when determining whether or not someone with mitochondrial disease can or should participate in exercise or not? So maybe if I go to you, Jane, first, and then maybe Jodi as well, for the advice that you give to people, especially around the swallowing.
I think for most of our patients, we recommend that they do exercise, but the guidelines that we kind of give them is to start small. So don't go and do a full workout at the gym all at once, pace yourself. Also, like Victoria said, you must eat and drink. So don't be dehydrated, make sure you have food on board. We often ask people to, if they're going to exercise, to do it to a degree where their heart rate's up a bit, they might get a bit hot, but they can still engage in a conversation. If they can't engage in a conversation, maybe they're working too hard in an aerobic capacity. The patients that we worry about more, I suppose, are the ones that have problems with what they call their lactates. So they often know that they have a problem with exercise, in the fact that they have previously had bad experiences with exercise where they've gone out and done something and then they've been vomiting or whatever afterwards. And so those are very few and far between. The majority of people can do it safely, but we often say just start with a few minutes and then gradually build it up and build it up and build it up. Don't try and exercise every day. Have a rest in between to allow yourself to recover. And I think that covers most things, but it is all on the guidelines if I've missed anything out.
Super, thank you. Jodi, maybe if there's anything you wanted to add to that.
Yeah, of course. I mean, we're in the realms at the moment with mitochondrial disease where there aren't any good evidence-based exercises or therapy exercises for swallowing and speech. And we have tried applying some of the exercise principles to other neuromuscular disease groups, but I certainly haven't used exercises per se with mitochondrial disease, because the swallowing and speech exercises are quite unique because those muscles are quite difficult to access. But one of the things we're really mindful of is if we work somebody hard with exercise, particularly mitochondrial disease, we might make it actually more difficult to swallow when you really need to be able to swallow. So the most important thing is that you'll continue able to eat and drink in a comfortable and safe way, and you're constantly exercising your speech and your swallowing every day, because you're usually trying to communicate in some way, and unless you're 100% tube fed, and even then you're still swallowing your saliva, so you are still working those muscles. And actually we would probably as speech therapists err towards the side of finding strategies that you can incorporate into your daily life rather than exercises per se.
Yeah, and we would follow up on that in the fact that, yes, it's more about fitting activity into your daily life instead of thinking I must go to the gym. Not everybody likes the gym, and at the moment probably our patients wouldn't want to go anyway. So it's very much about putting things into your daily routine so that you are generally more active. And we do also say that basically choose something that you enjoy doing, because you'll never carry on doing it if I ask someone to go for a jog or go out on a bike and they hate it, they're never going to do it. So they have to choose something that they enjoy doing.
Fantastic, thank you. Now, other questions. Are sugary foods good or bad for mitochondrial disease? Who wants to pick up on that one?
I think
Go on, you go.
I think everything in moderation is important, and so I'm sure that we like some chocolate from time to time, but especially for pleasure or when we are a bit stressed. But I think it probably also depends on whether you have any other health conditions. So for example, if you have diabetes, you really need to watch your sugar control. You don't really want it to be fluctuate too much. So I think in essence, moderation really.
Fantastic. Thank you. Sorry, I am looking at you, but I'm also looking at the questions. There's a question here that someone's husband has returned to work in a school with several positive coronavirus cases already. He uses all precautions, but is worried about passing the virus on to me. Have you got any advice?
I think just going back to what we said, I mean, the question obviously already alludes to the fact that they're putting precautions in place, I beg your pardon. The thing to do is, as soon as he comes home, is to make sure he's thoroughly washed his hands, essentially. So, you know, hand washing cannot be stressed enough for this. If he feels that his clothes have come into contact, particularly, you know, it depends where he works. If particularly special schools, it's quite difficult. You're much more likely to have bodily fluids splashed on you accidentally and the legs. If he feels that is the case, then he changes at the door and goes and has a shower and then comes back down. So it's just simple things really to look at that. But yes, hand washing definitely is the best thing we can do.
Brilliant, thank you. And I suppose actually just picking up on that, obviously children are going back to school now, or have gone back to school. Are we seeing in the mitochondrial community in general that their children have been going back okay? Have you heard otherwise?
Yeah, so certainly for the children that I look after, I've had a huge spectrum. So some of them went back during lockdown, actually. Again, a lot of it being for mental health reasons, either for themselves or for the wider family. And schools on the whole have been fantastic. You know, they have increased their hygiene measures. I think the teachers are coming home now stinking of bleach. It's all, you know, the hand washing thing has really been drummed home. So certainly I'm not aware of any who did go back during lockdown, it being a problem for. I do still have some children who haven't yet gone back to school, and again, that's either a personal reason for the family or the school themselves haven't felt that they want to take that risk, and that again goes back to very kind of individual personalized risk. But no, I'm not aware of any kind of negative impacts so far. The Royal College of Paediatrics did release guidance a few weeks back now, and mitochondrial disease was downgraded from being on the highly vulnerable, extremely vulnerable list to a kind of low to moderate category. And basically what that means is if you aren't sure about your child's medical condition, then actually you need to consult your paediatrician, be it your local paediatrician, your neurologist, one of us in the mitochondrial centres, to work out an individual plan. But there will be very, very few children whose disease is significant enough where we would be able to justify them not going back to school for physical reasons as opposed to their social and emotional well-being.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Fantastic, thank you, that's really, really helpful. And just actually to build on that point, following this session in a little while, we have an education session, another seminar series. So it starts at, my colleagues just told me, 4:30 this afternoon. So if you're interested in particular in schools, then do please join that session later on, or indeed watch it on the website later in the week. Moving back to our questions from the audience. If you are tube fed, is it better to feed regularly throughout the day and night, or give it a rest at night? And there's some more questions to this. Should you have more regular small feeds with fewer gaps? Or the person in question suffers from severe acid reflux, so advice has been to group feeds and give the stomach a rest between feeds. Does that sort of seem the right way forward?
Yeah, that's quite tricky. So it's when you're battling one disease against another, you've just got to go with the common ground. So again, I suppose I'm now going to switch back on what I said. So in this particular case, if they've been advised to group their feeds together, yes, they might have kind of prolonged gaps, but the dietitian will have looked at the mix of feed that they've got and will be looking for kind of longer acting carbohydrates particularly, so that's minimizing that kind of gap in feeding. Jodi, do you think that's fair enough from a speech point of view?
Yeah, I was going to say I'd always look to our dietitians to try and, for it's so individual and so bespoke, isn't it? So yeah, I don't think I'd add anything more to that.
Wonderful, thank you. Now we've had a really interesting question here, which actually, Antonella, prick your ears up. This will apply to you as well. Perhaps I'm sure you have a view on this. Is Brexit a threat to cooperation with Europe on mitochondrial research? Maybe Antonella, actually, I could start with you.
Unfortunately, yes. Unfortunately, we will be struggling for funding, because EU, we know, was going to support 30% actually of the research done in this country, and probably I can say that the immigration of this country is an elite immigration. I mean, I am an immigrant, but in a way I brought something, and with me so many other people in this. So therefore Brexit really would be a problem. However, I think I know many of the scientists that are working in UK. They start to have a little bit now to think how we can have also a base in Europe, not leave UK, but have a base in Europe, so that we can still do the same thing that we were doing before, and therefore advance our research vision. Because now for mitochondria, it's you know, there was some 30 years ago, there was the boom of the point mutation mitochondrial DNA. Every day there was a new one, and days there was a new one associated with the patients. Now I think we are in the moment where we are tackling the treatment, and to do science for the treatment, we require a lot of funds. Science cost.
Yes. So. But I mean, I suppose beyond the financial implication, will one would hope that you will still sort of speak to one another and share knowledge and to share data.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I think the mitochondrial community, we work each other. I mean, this morning I had with the meeting with Australia, and so it's, I mean, there is no boundaries. Unfortunately, we have this Zoom now, so therefore, absolutely there is no boundaries. The only boundaries will be finance, which will be a lower amount of money coming here, and so this could be a problem, but no others really.
Mm-hmm. And for you, Yi, I mean, presumably again, you will still be able to collaborate, maybe not in quite the same financial way, but collaborate with colleagues overseas.
I must say that actually the mitochondrial disease charities across the world actually are very strong, and they are very well connected and well networked. And so yes, the financial implications, but actually there are more initiatives and more work that's actually international cross and centers collaboration. So I think it's definitely going towards that way. Is going to be an international effort rather than we all work in silos.
Yeah, actually, you've just reminded me that MDUK is part of an international collaboration for mitochondrial diseases. So we have contact with our colleagues in many other countries and all across the world, Australia, the Netherlands, so obviously the Lilly Foundation in the UK, but I think the last I saw that there was a Finnish group charity that has joined the partnership. So yeah, that's really great, and we make sure that we talk to one another about things when we can. So there was one other question about someone saying about that they have IBM and was wondering whether they were at higher risk of regarding COVID. And I guess that goes back to the question that we were talking about before, that we know from the data that is coming from across Europe that many conditions, the data seem to be that people are not necessarily at a higher risk of catching the condition, but that and neither are they necessarily at any more risk of having more complex complications, if that's the right phrase, as a result of being exposed to COVID. So hopefully the data isn't, there's not a lot of data, but the data that are there imply that people aren't necessarily going to be affected more severely. Great. We talked a bit already about virtual appointments and how people have been sort of using these as a way of communicating with patients. Do you think that this is sort of something that will kind of continue into the future? So beyond COVID, let's be positive and think that there will be a time where COVID will be contained with vaccines and potentially with treatments. So do we think that perhaps, though, having said all of that, the video and the telephone calls will be something that will stay longer term? I know you're seeing nodding heads. Jodi, do you want to start?
Yeah, I mean, I can certainly speak on behalf of our kind of therapy team at Queen Square. We found it, I doubt very much that it's going to disappear post-COVID, whenever that might be, because I know that our patients that we've surveyed our patients, and actually our patients travel an awful long way to come to specialist centres. So a lot of our patients prefer to have their appointments remotely, particularly if clinicians don't need to get their hands on. So I doubt very much that we will go back to just face-to-face appointments. But having said that, I think wherever possible or wherever is necessary, we are bringing people in if we need to see them face to face. So if video isn't good enough, we don't do that just because that's what we do now.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And anyone else?
The only I think through doing a few video calls, I think there's two groups of patients may find this challenging, and which probably still benefit from face to face. One is those who have very severe hearing impairment. It's very difficult by telephone or even by video calls. They almost couldn't hear you properly. And even if they try to lip read, I don't think that is that successful. And the other one will be those who probably have some cognitive impairment, and they may not necessarily have carers that know them well enough to do the call with them. So there will be another group of individuals who benefit from face-to-face.
Yes, I would agree with that. Having done a telephone and video clinic this morning, at least one patient was actually not suitable for that. So that will have to be a face-to-face. I think the other group B would be our new patients. So actually, particularly for our therapists, it's really good for them to get their hands on our new patients so that they've got a baseline to work from. But follow-up appointments, yes, I would agree with Jodi completely. I think this will become the new norm, actually. Yes, I think telephone appointments and video conferencing is here to stay, really.
Yeah, I'd agree with Victoria that actually those new patients, it's nice for them to see you, and you know them, they know you, and build up a bit of a relationship, so that moving forward, if you have to go by phone or whatever, then they at least know who you are. Whereas if they've never ever met you, it's quite a challenge.
Yes, I can see that you want to build that personal rapport before you perhaps, yes, but certainly for telephone conversation. Yeah. And Jodi, for you too.
Yeah, I was just going to say it's amazing how creative you can get with people with hearing impairment and visual difficulties via video consultation as well. And I guess that's maybe useful to have a speech therapist occasionally in clinic to bring in those kind of extra kind of creative communication ways that you can get around occasionally. But I totally agree that there are always patients that are never, are not right for video clinics.
Super. I think we're very nearly at the end of the time. There at the moment are no more questions, but just to give the audience a quick prompt that if you have any more questions, quickly type them in, and we'll be able to get to them. One thing I was going to comment on, which is completely facetious point, I must admit, but of all of these sessions that we have done so far, definitely Victoria gets the prize for having a t-shirt wearing representative that's brilliant. So
I've got my mug as well, Kate.
Really quite that's brilliant. So I see that there are no more questions. We had one or two questions that came in through a different route about specific and personal cases. So we'll pick those up offline, as they say, so that we won't go into very specific issues right now. So I think we've pretty much come to the end of the session. I'm just checking with my colleagues that there are no more questions coming in. Oh, fantastic. There's a question. That's wonderful. Thank you so much. Thank you all so much. You answered my questions really and appreciated. So thank you. That's a thank you from our audience member. So thank you. And I would also like to thank the panel for their input, their time this afternoon. And it's been really great to have this conversation with you all. We've kind of come to the end of this session. As I said earlier, it will be available through our website and our YouTube channel later on this week. It's been, I think, very informative. Thank you to the panelists. Thank you to our sponsor, Sarepta. And I think that pretty much that's all. If you want to, don't forget there's the education seminar later on this afternoon, which will be chaired by my colleague Rob Burley. And well, that's it, I think. Thank you very much and have a good afternoon.
Thank you for having us.
Kate. Thank you.